There's a rare psychological trait that separates people who see themselves clearly from everyone else who's still operating on autopilot. And if you recognize even half of what I'm about to describe, you're already further along than you probably give yourself credit for. Most people move through their entire lives reacting instead of noticing, repeating patterns instead of examining them, mistaking their first impulse for the whole truth of who they are. But there's a smaller group of people who've developed something different, the ability to catch themselves in the act, to notice a reaction as it's happening instead of only understanding it in hindsight. And here's what's fascinating. The people who've developed this rarely realize how uncommon it actually is, because from the inside, it doesn't feel like a special skill. It just feels like being a little more tired than everyone else, a little more aware of things most people seem to move past without a second thought. What they don't realize is that this constant noticing isn't exhaustion without purpose. It's evidence of a psychological capacity most people never fully develop. Join me as we walk through 8 signs that you already have more self-awareness than you realize, because by the end of this, a lot of what you've quietly assumed was just overthinking is going to look a lot more like insight. Here's what almost nobody tells you about self-awareness. It isn't a personality trait some people are simply born with and others aren't. It's closer to a muscle that develops through friction, specifically the friction of catching your own reactions before they finish running. Most people never build this muscle because it requires something uncomfortable, watching yourself honestly in moments you'd rather just react and move on from. The people who do build it usually didn't choose to start out of curiosity. They usually started because something forced them to, a pattern that kept repeating, a relationship that kept ending the same way, a version of themselves they got tired of meeting again and again without understanding why. Sign 1. You've caught yourself mid-reaction and paused before finishing it. Most people only understand their reactions after the fact, replaying an argument later and realizing what they actually meant to say. But if you've ever felt a reaction rising, irritation, defensiveness, the urge to shut down, and actually noticed it while it was still happening, even without managing to change it in that exact moment, you're doing something most people never learn to do at all. The pause doesn't have to be perfect. The noticing itself is the actual skill. Sign 2. You can tell the difference between a feeling and the story you've built around it. Most people experience an emotion and a narrative about that emotion as a single, seamless event. I feel anxious, therefore something is genuinely wrong. But if you've ever noticed yourself thinking, I feel anxious, and separately noticing, and I'm not sure this anxiety is actually about what I think it's about, you've developed a level of separation between raw feeling and interpretation that takes most people years, if they ever get there at all. Sign 3. You've noticed the same pattern showing up across different people and different situations and stopped blaming each one individually. It's easy to explain away one difficult relationship, one bad job, one falling out, as simply about that specific person or circumstance. But if you've ever stepped back and thought, this keeps happening no matter who I'm with, so maybe there's something about how I show up that's worth looking at, you've done something most people actively avoid, because it's far more comfortable to keep finding a new external explanation than to consider your own consistent role in a repeating pattern. Sign 4. You can hear feedback that stings without immediately building a defense against it. Most people's first response to criticism is an internal search for why it's wrong, unfair, or exaggerated, sometimes before the sentence is even finished. But if you've noticed a moment, even a brief one, where you let uncomfortable feedback sit without immediately explaining it away, you're practicing a specific kind of tolerance that self-awareness actually depends on, the ability to hold something unflattering about yourself long enough to actually consider it. Sign 5. You've noticed yourself performing a version of who you think you should be, and felt the gap between that and who you actually are underneath it. Most people never notice the performance at all, because they've been running it so long, it simply feels like personality. But if you've ever caught a flash of that gap, a moment where you said something because it was expected rather than true, and actually registered the difference instead of letting it pass unnoticed, you're seeing something most people spend their whole lives without ever glimpsing. Sign 6. You can sit with not knowing why you did something, instead of immediately inventing a tidy explanation. Most people need an answer for their own behavior instantly, and if a clean one isn't available, they'll construct one quickly just to close the discomfort of not understanding themselves. But if you've ever genuinely said to yourself, "I don't actually know why I reacted that way," and let that uncertainty exist without rushing to resolve it artificially, you're demonstrating a rare tolerance for not having yourself fully figured out, which is actually a precondition for ever understanding yourself more accurately. Sign 7. You've noticed when your compassion for someone else is actually about avoiding a harder truth about yourself. This one is subtle. Most people experience their own generosity as simply good character, full stop. But if you've ever caught yourself being unusually understanding towards someone, specifically because confronting them honestly would have required confronting something uncomfortable in yourself too, and noticed that dynamic clearly, instead of only experiencing it as kindness, you've developed a level of self-observation that goes past most people's version of self-reflection entirely. Sign 8. Your self-criticism has started sounding less like punishment and more like information. Early on, most people's inner voice after a mistake is harsh, global, and identity-based. "I'm terrible at this. I always mess things up." But if you've noticed that voice shifting towards something more specific and useful, "That particular choice didn't work. Here's what I'd do differently," you're not just becoming kinder to yourself. You're demonstrating that your self-observation has matured past simple judgment into something that can actually be used. Now, understanding where you are in this matters, because this ability develops in stages, and most people get stuck without realizing which stage they're actually in. Stage 1 is the unconscious stage. You feel the effects of your patterns constantly: exhaustion, repeated conflict, a vague sense that something keeps going wrong, but you experience all of it as something happening to you rather than something you're participating in. People in this stage often develop a strong, well-reasoned external narrative for every difficulty, because the alternative, looking inward, feels destabilizing in a way that's easier to avoid entirely. Stage 2 is the noticing stage. You start catching glimpses, a pattern here, a reaction there, a gap between your performance and your actual feelings. This stage is often uncomfortable, because noticing without yet knowing what to do about it can feel like exposure without resolution. Many people retreat back into stage 1 here, simply because sustained noticing without immediate answers is genuinely hard to tolerate. Stage 3 is integration, where the noticing stops being occasional and starts being a fairly steady internal presence. At this stage, you're not constantly shocked by your own patterns anymore, because you've already met most of them. Self-awareness here isn't a dramatic, ongoing revelation. It's closer to a quiet, working familiarity with your own mechanics. But here's what almost nobody warns you about this skill. Even once you've developed real self-awareness, there are shadow versions worth watching for. The paralysis shadow, where constant self-examination turns into an excuse for never actually acting, because there's always one more layer to analyze first. The self-flagellation shadow, where noticing your own patterns turns into a new, more sophisticated way to punish yourself rather than simply understand yourself. And the superiority shadow, where your capacity for self-observation quietly turns into looking down on people who haven't developed it yet, forgetting that you once moved through the world exactly as unconsciously as they do now. The goal was never to achieve some final, complete state of total self-knowledge. It was to build a working relationship with your own patterns, close enough that they stop running you completely, honest enough that you can actually use what you notice instead of just accumulating it as evidence against yourself. If any part of this resonated with you, if you recognized a moment of catching yourself mid-reaction, or noticed the gap between a performance and the truth underneath it, leave a comment and let me know which sign landed closest to home. Chances are you're not the only one who's been quietly doing this work without a name for it. Thanks for listening to episodes of Kynn. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.